In this video I will tell why is there several versions of AFE firmware and not just one, what are the available versions of AFE firmware and what specific firmware versions can be used for. My name is Adrian, I develop AFE firmware and I run Smartly.dom website. In the previous video, the link is above, I mentioned that AFE firmware comes in several versions and there is no single version that supports all possible components such as relays, buttons, sensors and has all possible functionalities. There are different versions of AFE firmware available and they support specific components and specific functions related to those components. Why there are several versions of AFE firmware and not just one? ESP8266, ESP8285 and ESP32 have a limited memory that stores the firmware, so-called program memory. Depending on the ESP type, it is from 500 kilobytes to 16 megabytes, where typically it's 4 megabytes. I apologize in advance that I'm slightly misleading when I speak of kilobytes, megabytes. The correct unit when talking about the size of ESP memory is kibibytes, megabytes, but the difference are so minor that it is a waste of time to discuss them further. By saying that there is not so much available memory, because with adding support of new hardware components, sensor, adding a new function, the size of the firmware gets bigger and bigger, and it introduces basically a risk that at some point there might be insufficient flash memory available for the next functionalities enhancements. Secondly, I want to have a functionality of upgrading AFE firmware versions over the air, so by the internet browser. And that means that the memory in ESP-based devices must be at least one size larger than the size of the firmware to first download the firmware to the flash, and once finished successfully, then replace the old firmware with the downloaded one. And the third one, I try to make the configuration panel and the integration with home automation systems as intuitive as possible, and this is also ultimately associated with the size of the firmware. Basically, there is more code needed. Today, AFE firmware, depending on the version, is between 400 to 500 kilobytes. This means that it requires ESP microcontroller with at least 1 megabytes flash memory size. If I wanted to make one version that handles everything, then I would have to limit myself to the ESP microcontroller with 4 megabytes or 16 megabytes memory. I couldn't offer AFE firmware for devices like this one, which is 1 megabyte. I am also not a fan of firmware or any other software with gazillions features, and in reality very few I use on daily basis. It is a waste of resources that are limited in such small hardware. There is a risk of reducing the stability and efficiency of devices itself, and finally there is required more extensive effort to test, analyze potential problems, fix these defects and so on. I will now move and talk about the different versions of AFE firmware, but before I would like to mention that within each version of AFE firmware there are certain functionalities which are common to each version. Each version has an API for integration with home automation system. There is a possibility to configure a backup connection to additional Wi-Fi network. It is possible to protect configuration with a password. There is a LED light indication functionality that informs about the current status of the device. There is an option to upgrade the software by the internet browser or over the internet. There are more and more of such common functionalities in AFE firmware which are available in each version. I am calling AFE firmware T0 as a basic version of AFE firmware. It's for turning on and off a device connected to our ESP module. From the hardware perspective, it supports up to 4 relays, 5 buttons and 5 LEDs. It's perfect for devices such as Sonoff Basic, for Channel Sonoff, Shelly, or any other do-it-yourself devices. I use this version mainly to turn on the lighting at home according to, for example, program schedules or just from a smartphone. My ringing bell is triggered by this version, or behind this panel there is a device with AFE firmware which turns this panel on and off, for example, when I go sleep. There is a timer built in this firmware, which, for example, cuts off the power of the equipment connected to the device with AFE firmware after configured time. The AFE firmware T1 version differs from T0 version basically that it additionally supports up to 8 temperature sensor DS18B20 and has a built-in thermostat and thermal protection functionalities. So apart from measuring temperature and sending this data to the automation system, it can also control relays, so turning them on and off depending on the temperature value of one or more temperature sensors. Something like that can be used everywhere where switching something on/off depends on the temperature. It can be, for example, valves in the heating system which can be open or closed depending on the temperature in a given room. AFE firmware T2. The difference between just mentioned T1 is that it uses DH11, 21 or 22 temperature and humidity sensor. Firmware has a thermostat, hygrostat and thermal protection functionalities. It can control the switching relays depending on the value of temperature or humidity of one or a maximum of 4 DH sensors. With this firmware you can, for example, control a bathroom fan that starts drawing moist from the bathroom if the humidity in the bathroom exceeds a set value. And the fan will turn off, actually the AFE firmware will turn off when the humidity level drops to the level defined within the AFE firmware. AFE firmware T4 was born from the need to control more relays and monitor more inputs with connected, for example, motion sensors, magnetic sensors, in general sensors with binary state open-closed or on-off. As you well know, ESP has limited number of inputs and outputs, so-called GPOs. Therefore, to handle an increased number of such, AFE uses a MCP23017 microcontroller working on IIC bus. Two such ports expanders are supported by AFE firmware, and this makes it possible to connect up to 32 external devices, for example 16 relays, 4 buttons and 4 motion sensors. The use of this firmware is basically similar to the T0 version, while the difference is a significantly greater number of relays and buttons available for connection, and additionally binary sensors, those for example motion sensors mentioned, which can send motion detections to our home automation system. AFE firmware T5 is mainly intended for gates and wickets. Please be aware that hardware built on ESP microcontroller with AFE T5 version is not a substitute for a regular gate controller that controls the gate engine. AFE version T5 adds to an existing gate controller wireless control function that is opening and closing the gate using, for example, smartphone, and viewing the information on whether the gate is open or closed from anywhere in the world, of course with an access to the internet. In other words, AFE firmware T5 enables an integration of our gate with an automation system. I use the software to control my gate and add wickets, where in case of the wicket, a device with firmware T5 acts as intercom with my card's reader, which is supported by this version of AFE firmware as well. I call AFE firmware T6 the weather station. It supports larger number of different sensors, gives the possibility of reading and sending to home automation system basic parameters related to air, such as temperature, humidity, but also atmospheric pressure, air quality, dust level, lightning, wind level or amount of rainfall. There's much more of this parameter. While recording this video, I'm working on the AFE Firmware T7. The T7 supports multicolored LEDs and LED strips. I need this version to indicate various events in my home. Let's say when LEDs starts flashing red, I know that my wife is near my home and I have like 5 minutes to finish a cocktail. While recording this video, I do not know yet what this version will eventually evolve into. By saying that, I encourage you to view detailed and always up-to-date information regarding each of the versions I have described in this video. The link is above and below the video. In the next video, I will talk about how to upload and upgrade the firmware. So thank you for taking the time to watch it, and I encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you find it useful.